Rioso, and welcome back to the Welsh History Podcast. This is a special edition episode, one that I've been kind of neglecting because I kind of forgot. Not gonna lie. If you ever wonder if I'm good with anniversary dates and remembering them, this is probably your answer. So, as of the end of May, beginning of June of this year, we have reached the 10th anniversary of the Welsh History Podcast. I am somewhat flummoxed that we reached this milestone and I completely blanked it. And it is what it is. Last year we had our 200th episode and we kind of went through questions that people were asking about podcast and we kind of did some things on that. But because I've been silly and forgot, I'm going to move away from that and we're going to try and move into a different discussion. I just want to start off by saying thank you to everyone who listens to this series. Uh, I know some of this ground is going to be covered. I may have covered in the past. If so, I'm sorry if I'm just restating some things. I'm going to try and keep it a little bit different than that. I think that it's good to always be a little different. But I did want to start out by just saying how grateful I am for everybody who listens to this podcast, who donates to help this podcast, listens to the advertising that goes on in this podcast. All of these things are very helpful to me and personally make a lot of difference. And realistically, as I always say, if you guys weren't listening, I wouldn't bother with the podcast because why would you bother doing a podcast when you aren't necessarily reaching an audience? I mean, you could just do that on your own. So for me, this has been a really great thing. And it's something I've always appreciated and I don't take for granted by any means. And I've always thought about how to make better choices with the podcast. Obviously, some things I would love to do with it, I haven't been able to do, but I'm hoping to do over the next few years. And I hope it's helpful. We are currently in what I call the third season. I will say those are completely arbitrary seasons because I went from episode 1 to episode 100 and called that, well, roughly around 100 and called that season 1. And then season 2 was the part between that and the beginning of the 200s. And everything after 200 has been the so called third season. Our fourth season, such as it is, will begin with the start of World War One, and that's coming. I'm assuming sometime in the autumn, just because I don't always have a good understanding of where the podcast is going to go. Partially because when I go into subjects, there is a tendency for me to realize that, oh, actually, I want to talk about this. Oh, actually, I want to talk about that. I really didn't think we would get episodes on certain subjects just because they were originally not something I thought about, but as I was doing research and as I was looking into details about something, I was like, oh, actually, yeah. And, or conversely, there's subjects that I know of from other history that I have studied and read about. And so I kind of sit there and get excited about it because, oh, yeah, we covered this in such and such a place, and I start looking it up to see if there's any sort of practical applications in Wales. And lo and behold, quite often it's, oh yeah, there definitely is some application. The social gospel episode that we recently did is literally that. It was something that was very important to the history I did at university, and it's an area that I have a lot of fascination in personally. So for me, I was curious to kind of see how that movement worked in Wales. So I started looking into it, and that's how I found the episode I ended up recording. And in fact, the recent one about education is kind of a continuation of that. And you'll see that we're going to go into it even further in the next episode that we release next month. For me, that's a big part of it. You can never really tell how long you're going to spend on a subject because you think, well, have I covered it enough or have I covered it too much? And you kind of debate with yourself about it. I've really debated that with the monarchy over the years because I don't like talking too in depth about the English monarchy. One, because there's other podcasts for that. Two, because While it definitely affects Britain and the United Kingdom, it's not specific to Wales all the time. So I don't want to get into a lot of discussions of like what was King Charles II doing when he da 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 da, or what was George III up to in the middle of the American Revolution, and how much does that have to do with Wales? That's always a question for me. And so I like to give context about events. I like to go into further details because you do want to have a picture of what the image of the world is at the time. Because if I just say, oh, and in Wales, da 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 da, oh, and by the way, a bunch of people left Wales to go fight in World War I, and here's the beginning of their involvement, then you have no background to why they're there. And if maybe you don't really know, it's a great way of kind of reinforcing or informing those that may be unclear. Why are we talking about World War I? What's the cause of World War I? So you always want to give background. But as I said, I always want to encase that in what does it mean for Wales? What's the reason why we're talking about it? And does it in the end go back to Wales? Sometimes I felt like when we get into discussing, say, the English Revolution, or when we're talking about the War of the Roses, it is very important to Wales. Wales is involved quite frequently in both of those wars, but quite often we're talking about completely English things and not much about Wales itself. And so then I have to kind of parse what is important and what isn't. That is very difficult sometimes. But again, trying to always give context. I mean, the reality of it is the War of the Roses leads us to the only monarchy that was really of some sort of Welsh ancestry. For me, that's a big part of it. Always something I consider. I try and maintain a level of cohesion towards those stories. When we're talking about Roman Britain, for example, I'm not going to go wandering into what Emperor Trajan did in Dacia necessarily, uh, but I will talk about why is he so important to Roman Britain. Same thing with Hadrian. Same thing with any number of other emperors. Like you saw what we did with Claudius. We talked about Claudius. We got you to the point where you understand why he was doing what he was doing. And I think that's important to have that context, but I think it's also important to be clear why he's not, the main character, to put it bluntly. So for me, that was important. I think it's significant to maintain that separation, but at the same time, I don't want people to misunderstand what's going on, and I don't want people to struggle to keep up with the story and kind of put it in context with the larger world. So thus again, we always go back to kind of describing it. Very long-winded explanation to kind of explain that as we go into things like World War I, we are going to talk about how we got there, why we're there, what the hopes and aspirations of various parties are in World War I, and why is Wales being dragged into it, and what does the Welsh population think? Because it is very interesting as you read about it, and I've started reading. It is interesting to kind of see the public perception of the whole thing, and how there's a bit of a break between the public and the politicians in some respects, and why that is, but not in the way you might think, if I'm blunt. So it'll be interesting to cover, and I'm excited. But I don't want to get in my head of myself. We still got lots to talk about before we get there. The Edwardian period is still one of those periods that's very dense with information, so it's worth talking about in further detail before we get to that point. You need to understand where we're going, so I think that's it's always good to have context. Hopefully that's helpful. Hopefully that's informative. I realize it does take us away from the discussion of the big event stuff, and it moves us into very specific parts of history, which some people may not find as interesting, but I think it's important at the end of the day to understand history, to come to grips with it in a proper way, in a proper manner. We need to have the context needed to do that. We need the background. We need all those extra information. You can't really understand modern UK socialism without understanding the social gospel movement that preceded it. You don't really understand the suffrage movement without understanding the temperance movement that preceded it. All of these things give context to it. It all gives us an overwhelming sign of what is to come. And it's something that's key to history. As any person who studies history can tell you, this means a lot and it makes a major difference in the overall story of the history of Wales. And it gives us a great ground point to work from because once we have this information, then when we bring it up later, you go, oh, I understand. We've talked about this. We understand this. We recognize where things have come from and how they've got there. And I think that's incredibly important when we're doing the work that we're trying to do, when we're trying to understand the things we're trying to understand. It's critical in the way history is taught, and it is a part of a method I've tried to use in the past, which is if we're going to talk about this later, then we need to understand how we got there. We can't talk about the Aberfan disaster without having a concept of why it happened, where the problems with the coal tipping came out of, and what the mentality was that created the situation that then led to that. That's kind of the context I'm trying to give, that kind of understanding when we build these kind of things as far as Welsh history goes. Long winded response again, but we're trying to describe where we're going. So I'm excited about that. So 10 years ago, when I started the podcast, I've explained why I started the podcast several times. If you need to go back and listen to episodes where I've talked about this, I talked about it in the 200 episode. I talked about it in the past. So I don't want to rehash everything. My love of history, and especially Welsh history, is built upon that background that I have. I'm not a historian. I'm not somebody who can pull back and say I'm a historian. What I am is a podcaster, obviously. But what I bring to the discussion, what I find important, is that I do have a background in history. I am professionally trained as a historian in one aspect, in the fact that I took 4 years of education as a history bachelor degree, and I've taken a little bit further with a master's degree. I haven't gotten a master's degree, but I took a few courses. And so I feel relatively confident being able to speak as someone who can do the research, can at least pull things together that make sense and make it sensible and gain a bit of understanding and, listen to the bits they're interested in. And hopefully that's most of it. And hopefully you get something out of it. So that's kind of my context. I always tell people it's like history is my passion, not necessarily my profession. So that's kind of important, I think. Also, in context, I will say that this podcast is not, in case anybody's wondering, a venture out of, the goodness of my heart necessarily. I do get some things from it. One of which is I learn a lot about Welsh history. I think that has been a large reason why I've wanted to continue to do the podcast because I'm learning so much more than I would have learned before. I can probably talk about issues that, 10 years ago, I wouldn't be able to tell you anything about it. I didn't really, I lived in Cardiff for 4 years. I saw the Anne Bevins statue all through those 4 years. I read a little blurb. So I knew about his NHS development, but beyond that, I didn't know anything about him. So reading more about influences for him, really cool. And it's one of those things I look at and say, hey, this gives me much more context on something. I think learning about when you study Welsh history or when you're kind of in I'm interested in Welsh history, a lot of people focus in on the Edward the First of it all, the conquest, the eventual rebellions, the parts of history that stand out because there's so much about them critical to what Wales is now. But I also think that it's important to understand, and I hope I'm getting that across, that there's a lot of other things that have dictated what Wales is and who Welsh are and how community has developed from the beginning. And I think understanding how the language has survived in the face of so much pressure, even to the point where if you look at the other Celtic languages, I would argue that Welsh has always done better at surviving, even though it was the longer conquested. And I don't fully have the explanation as to why. I couldn't rightly say. I'm sure there is very good reasons that others could tell you, but to me, that's always been very fascinating. Welsh and its ancient precursor, Brythonic, are old languages. They're so ancient in their way. To lose them is a loss that we really can't afford. And it's a reason to be grateful for those that kept it going. Very important. Imagine if, say, we had the writings in Welsh that we do, but we didn't have the context that we have today, and we didn't have English translations and Latin translations of Welsh documents. How difficult our life would be at trying to learn how Welsh was pronounced, how it was spoken. All those things that we struggled with Egyptian and Akkadian, and you know, all these ancient languages that at one time went extinct, and we didn't have any clue how they were pronounced. So we found things like the Rosetta Stone. It's such a pity to lose that. So I think it's important to remember that when we talk about Cymraeg and the influence it has on general society and how critical it is to basically the Welsh culture in general. Um, I mentioned in the last episode, I think Welsh culture is fine. I don't think it's in any danger of going extinct anytime soon. I think it was preserved because people in the 1700s decided to preserve it, and that made a massive difference. And they did so through some ways I would call fakery, but at the same time, without them, it doesn't really have a leg to stand on, and it struggles. But if you take the time and take the effort and I learned those things, the language, on the other hand, is a whole different story. The language could have gone extinct. Language could have disappeared, and there was many points where it probably might have, but it struggled along and it continued to remain, and we have it today. I'm not going to moralize through this whole thing, but something that kind of stood out to me, and I kind of went, yeah. Like we talk about, we love the language, we want the language to survive, then we complain when we have to use the language. And it's like, yeah, the language is hard compared to English because English is hard for other people who try and learn English. But at the same time, it is the language of this area. It was the language of the ancestors of this area. And it was for, even before there was an English language, really. So to throw that away is baffling to me. Doesn't mean I can speak it now. Doesn't mean I'm really good at it. Definitely no. I think we all know that. But I love the language. I just wish I was better at it personally. And I'm trying to get better at it, but it's taking a while. Generally, I just try and go, okay, well, whatever I said, I'll try and maintain consistency, even if it's slightly wrong. And if I find out it's very wrong, I'll amend. But I'm not going back to re-record the podcast. Because if you listen to early podcasts, the way I mispronounced things was pretty across the board. And I haven't gone back to edit those. However, saying all that, I really do appreciate everyone's contribution to the podcast. I really appreciate it. It's taken a while over the 10 years to kind of get where I wanted to go with this podcast, to get to the point where I was happy with how it was coming out. And hopefully that is coming across. I hope for those of you watching the video format of this podcast that you enjoy it, that even though it's just mostly a talking head, that it's still something you get value from. And I hope it works for you. Thank you very much. And thank you for so many kind words that have come in over the years. I really do appreciate it. You don't understand how much it means to me that people get something from us, that they really appreciate it. Would I love for the audience to be bigger? Sure. Anybody who says they don't care are either not interested in really doing what they're doing, or two, are lying to you. You are the lifeblood of this podcast. Your contributions, your support has gone in a long way in keeping this podcast afloat, long past, for some people, its sell by date. And for that, I really appreciate it. And I certainly could do nothing without you. So keep that in mind. You guys are amazing. And your willingness to listen to this podcast is incredible. Thank you. And on all of that, I guess I will say I appreciate that we've come a long way. And the more I look at the way I deal with things now versus then, it amazes me how far we did get. But with all of that and with everything that we've had over the last few years, it is wonderful to mark an event like this. It's wonderful to realize just how much things have grown and changed over the years. And I just, again, I can do nothing but say thank you. Every person who listens to this podcast, whether they picked it up at the beginning and listened all the way through, or only listened to the bits that they like, or only aired up into a certain point and stopped listening, I appreciate you for that, because you don't know. So often you put things out and you wonder if people are listening, and to see numbers is not as good as hearing when people get back to you and say, "Oh yeah, I started with this episode and I've listened through all of this," or I went back and I listened to everything, or I'm behind right now but I'm catching up. Da, 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 da. It does fill me with a lot of happiness, because it means that you are getting something from it and you're enjoying it, which is honestly a big reason to continue. Because if it hadn't have been for that, I probably would have stopped 5 years ago now, almost. And yeah. So with all of that said and done, if you want to contact me and complain or send flowers or whatever, you can do so. And I will say, again, sorry, if you have business questions, concerns, or whatever, please email me. Don't contact me on social media. I don't really respond to those on social media, and it gets me a little frustrated when people do that. So best way to contact me for those kind of things is welshhistorypodcast@gmail.com. I realize most of you won't do that, so that's okay. But if you have questions or comments or anything else, definitely put it that way first if you can. Next to social media, at that point, I do try to respond. As I've often said, not every social media gets the same level of interest from me. So because of that, I don't always check things like Spotify comments or something I didn't even know existed like a year ago. And as they've come up, I've been like, oh, these exist. So if those don't get commented on, it's typically because I didn't even know those were there. And the same thing goes with Threads. I am on Threads because when you're on Facebook and you're on Instagram, they kind of force you onto Threads. I don't use Threads. I don't like the way it's formatted, so I've never used it. So even though my account is there, I'm never going to respond to a thread post. I don't even know if I know what my password is there, so that's something to keep in mind. I do use Blue Sky quite frequently. That was pretty much my main social media site other than Instagram for the last few months. And I do check Twitter now again. So if you post things to me on Twitter, I will see them. And I have gone back to posting the podcast episodes there, but it's not my preferred option. And like I said, I am on Instagram. I am on Blue Sky. I am on, a number of different things. And of course, Facebook. And for most things, it's Welsh History Pod, except for, as I've said before, Facebook, which is facebook.com/Welsh History Podcast. And of course, as always, we have a Patreon. There is stuff going up there. The next episode in our series on Roman Britain is going up in July, probably towards the end of July, just as a warning, because it does take me a bit to get that, because it is a bit more in depth. I do take some time on those to get them working better. And that will go up in July, and hopefully we'll have further content after that. I will let you know as we get closer to the date. It depends on if I'm able to get recordings done in the places I want to get them done. We'll see. With all that said, nonetheless, thank you once again. Have yourselves a wonderful rest of the day, and Diolch yn fawr. Welsh History Podcast is a member of the Evergreen Podcast Network. To find more information on them, you can do so at evergreenpodcasts.com. Thanks for listening.